We're talking today to Brian Doughton, who's the senior pastor of Northwood Church in Maple Grove, Minnesota. And he has something that he calls Faith Stories that they've done in their church for a number of years. And so maybe we could begin, Brian, by just describing what a faith story is and how that got started.
So a faith story is a 5-minute story of how somebody has become a believer in Jesus Christ and how Christ has changed their life and the difference he's made in them. And then sometimes the story really is primarily about that. And sometimes the story also will spread into other things like how they're now trying to be a witness for the Lord. Sometimes the story will actually be more about that than it will be about their conversion. Mm-hmm. But, all of us have been in context, I think, as church leaders where we hear people share the word, historical word is a testimony. And a faith story is another way of sharing a testimony of what God has done in your life. These are not spontaneous presentations. These are planned in advance. We even, as much as we're able to, we try to connect the person's story with a sermon topic or the worship theme for the day, for that particular Sunday. And they're also written in advance. They're timed out. People come well prepared. So it's not just kind of an off-the-cuff kind of a testimony. What has God done in your life today kind of moment. It's people that come prepared to share their story with the congregation. Northwood Church is a daughter church from Wooddale Church in Eden Prairie, another a city here in the metro. And they birthed 9 churches. We're number 6 in the birth order. And to my knowledge, every one of the churches, because of our mother church, does these. This is an important part of all of our ministries because we've all seen the value and the benefit of it.
You have a very careful coaching process that you go through. Could you kind of describe that for us?
Sure. Well, probably the best coaching process is that people sit in the congregation week after week and listen to other people do this. So they already have a sense in their mind as you start to work on their own story, what a faith story is and kind of what the boundaries are, what typically happens. So the examples of what has happened before really inform the people as they think about what they're going to share. But we have a written set of guidelines that we've created, which are real basic, real simple. And they have kind of some do's and don'ts. And the don'ts are, don't turn this into a life story. Don't criticize any church or denomination, or don't say things that could be offensive, be interpreted offensive. And do share how Christ has come into your life, how he's changing your life, and ways that you can talk about the Lord in a positive way, or that transformation in a positive way, I should say. So those are the do's and the don'ts, but we send those written guidelines to people who agreed to do their faith story. And then I ask them to write it in advance and send me a copy a couple of weeks before their date in which they're going to give it. And then I will read it and then get back to them either with a face-to-face meeting or a phone conversation or an email response. I'm finding that most recently here in the last year or two that the email or the phone conversation is working fine and works well for us. I don't have to sit down with somebody and go over it, like at a coffee shop or have them come into the office. When I first came to Northwood, there was a lot of that because then we're kind of like introducing something kind of new and trying to create this culture of people doing their faith story. Now that it's embedded in the culture, I don't find that I have to give as much time to the coaching side of it as I once did.
How much time would this typically take out of your schedule as the pastor?
Well, the biggest challenge right now is the scheduling of them, and that takes time. Tracking people down, talking to them, finding a date that works in their calendar that also works, with the church calendar. Sometimes when I contact somebody and initially they say, yes, I'd like to do that, it may be a couple more contacts before we can settle on a date with what I present to them with what they present. I try to always be, in addition, Larry, I try to be around 3 months in advance. So this is not like, next week. or next month. I try to be 3 months out ahead of the schedule.
How many of these faith stories would Northwood have in a typical year?
Yeah, well, prior to this conversation today, I actually got the schedule out from this past year. And because we're at the start of the next year, I actually went through the list of faith stories in the previous year, and I counted 27 faith stories that we had in the course of the year. We do them, we try to schedule them for 3 out of the 4 Sundays of a month. One Sunday, of course, is communion. We do that typically the first Sunday of the month, and so on communion Sundays, we don't do faith stories. In addition, we've had some special Sundays in the course of the year where it might be a recognition of a staff member for their 5-year or 10-year anniversary, work anniversary. There might be a special Sunday where, like one Sunday a year, we host the Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge Choir, and they give actually like 5 faith stories from people from within the choir. So it's still a faith story Sunday, just not us doing it. And then we have like a second grade Bible presentation on a Sunday morning where we bring the second graders and we publicly give them a Bible and talk about the importance of teaching the Bible to our children. And historically, consistently, 27 to 30 Sundays a year include a faith story.
What are some examples of how faith stories have allowed the congregation to see the ways God's at work in your community between Sundays?
Yeah, great question. So in the month of January, which was last month, we had 2 faith stories. One of which was a faith story from a young woman who grew up in our church. She's now a young adult. She is preparing to be a missionary, and she gave us her faith story was about her faith and how she became a believer, but also the recent Urbana Missions Conference that she went to, and the way God is leading her to become a missionary. And so that was an opportunity for us to do a couple things. One is just to celebrate. She's a daughter of our church, and she's growing in her faith, and she's responding to a call of God in her life to missions. And that to me was just like, is a big win for our church family to see this. In fact, she probably will be our first homegrown missionary, somebody who started with us as a baby, and now she's going to become a missionary. So that was a big moment for us.
Wow, yeah.
And another one this last month was, Minneapolis is hosting the Weekend to Remember Marriage Conference in the month of March, which is the Campus Crusade or the Family Life Today marriage conference. And so I asked a couple to share their faith story of where they were a year ago, because I know he's become a believer since last year. And so they together talked about where they were in their marriage, because they went to this marriage conference like 2 weeks after this guy became a believer. And so he talked about the transformation he's experienced in his life and how much better they are in their marriage. That he didn't realize really how their marriage was nearly falling apart until, 1, he became a Christian, and 2, until he had some good teaching about what marriage is at this Weekend to Remember conference. It's one of the things that's so great about these faith stories week in and week out is C.S. Lewis has the great line about community when he says community is defined when you hear somebody say something and you say, "You too?" And that happens so much, I think, just as people share their story. These are things which sometimes I'm privy to. They don't, it's not conversations I'm a part of, but just the connections that people have afterwards, in between, weeks, and or a couple of weeks ago they heard somebody share something, and then they go up to them and talk to them about the common experience or the common feeling that they've had, and how that just connects people together.
Real community building.
Oh, it's huge. The faith stories have also been, in many ways, invitations for people to go deeper in the life of the church. So sometimes the faith stories are how somebody has grown in their faith, become a Christian, or grown in their faith because of small groups. Or this last fall, for the first time, we launched Alpha. We've had some faith stories connected to small groups and connected to Alpha. And what happens is when people hear the stories of others being impacted by those ministries, they get involved. They step up. We're going to launch the next session of Alpha tomorrow night, and we anticipate close to 60 people coming.
Hmm.
And I have to believe it's because we started this last fall with our first session with it. And I got a faith story from another church that I knew of a man who became a believer who was from a Hindu background, who had never explored Christianity, but he had moved to this country. He was invited to go, and through a set of circumstances, he came reluctantly, fearfully, but he couldn't ignore what he heard, and he couldn't ignore what he was feeling, and he became a Christian. So this church did a video faith story of him for their church, and I knew about it because of a connection I have with that church, and I asked if I could have that video to show in our church.
Hmm.
And so they gave that to us. We showed it. And that was just a huge step forward for us, where we borrowed somebody else's faith story and showed it in our context. And it's really helped us.
If someone were to come to you and say, Brian, would you ever give up faith stories? What would you tell them?
I'd say it's the heart of our church, the heartbeats of our Sunday worship experience. I think people would say, you know, the preaching's okay, the music is really good, but those faith stories, what happened to those faith stories? Where are they? Bring them back. You know,
Yeah.
people love them. It is consistently one of the things I hear from people about what they enjoy most about our services, because people expect a preacher to get up and speak, and they expect it to be interesting. They expect it to be biblical. They expect it to be challenging. But when somebody who's just a regular churchgoer gets up and talks in an intelligent manner, in a personal way, and they're open and vulnerable to the congregation, ooh, you know, the credibility that they have and the connection that happens, those to me are sometimes the holiest moments that we have in our church, in our gatherings. So, yeah, I don't think you could convince us not to do this. Every now and then, I do an interview faith story because circumstances sort of call for that. So the interview format would be, 3-4 questions that are. So first, tell us about you. Tell us about how you became a believer. Tell us about how Christ has changed your life.
Yeah.
Because some people just honestly get locked up about they want to talk about the Lord and about how he's changed their life, but they get locked up in trying to organize themselves. And they say to me, well, will you ask me questions? Because I'll be able to do that better. And so I will say that. I'll be happy to do that with him. And then every now and then we have a child do a faith story. And those are especially powerful. And this last year in June on World Relief Sunday, World Refugee Sunday, we had a refugee girl who's in our congregation, and I did an interview with her about growing up in the Kakuma refugee camp in northwest Kenya. And she and her family now have come to live in the Twin Cities. Our church has been a sponsoring church for them. They become part of our congregation. And Emanuela is her name. She's has a father who's Burundian, a mother who's Rwandan, and she's from nowhere because she was born in a refugee camp. So when you ask a young girl like that, where are you from? She doesn't really have a country to say where she's from. She says, I'm from a refugee camp. But she shared her story of coming to this country and what life has been like for her. She moved here when she was 11, and now she is 13. And so we were doing an interview with her, and that was really a great moment for us as a congregation too. Part of it is because our church we've gone all in on refugee ministry. We are a welcoming church to refugees, and this was a great win for our congregation to see this young girl talk about her relationship with Christ, and also the fact how much she enjoys being in America, with the exception of homework. She doesn't like homework.